extent. The media doesn't want to tell you about all of this, but Trump is facing a phalanx of judges who hate his guts. The number one issue recently, it seems, is obviously the president's executive orders and efforts to, as I've highlighted or observed before, gain political control over the administrative state, exercise the rights of the American people, or exercise the rights to self-government on behalf of the American people, so that the bureaucrats actually do what the American people expect them to do, as delineated through the election, namely the election of President Trump, and to obviously a major extent Congress as well. So in light of that, you've had President Trump take dramatic steps for reform that have been challenged, in my view, in court in a way that's inappropriate, not in the sense that, you know, the left is going to do what the left does in terms of challenging everything Trump does. The trouble is when the courts let them do it despite the rule of law. And some folks have been talking about impeaching judges. I don't know about that. We couldn't even impeach Biden. Are they going to impeach a judge over one adverse ruling against Trump? I doubt it. But I talked about this issue with Rob Schmidt on Newsmax just the other day.
Yeah, when you have a series of judges making extraordinary rulings that I think most would agree wouldn't have been made in similar circumstances for the president of another political party, or anyone not named Trump for that matter, you have to raise the question about whether politics whether politics are behind these judicial rulings or the rule of law. You know, typically, you know, judges don't intervene in a light way, the way these judges have intervened to prevent the president from doing what presidents since the beginning of time have been able to do, which is to exercise the executive function, for instance, of firing someone or pausing funding for a minute and a half to make sure there's nothing fraudulent going on.
Yeah, and for the courts to be intervening in this absurd manner or emergency fashion, to me is just an indication that anti-Trump animus, rather than the rule of law, is guiding their decision making. You know, and to kind of take the point further, I'm not a lawyer, but the lawyers will understand what I'm saying, and I hope I'm able to share my limited understanding with you in a way that allows you to understand it, is that when you seek an injunction, right, when you ask the court to intervene in an emergency fashion, there are kind of certain standards you need to meet in order for the court to be able to do that under law. And one of the standards is irreparable injury, meaning that unless it's stopped now, this person can never be made whole again. Well, in almost every case that Trump has been challenged, that standard hasn't been met. Namely, people suing to get their jobs back. It's the exact opposite. It tells you that's not an irreparable injury. A, they eventually could get their job back, or they could be made whole by someone writing a check to them. So at least one judge backed away from that injunction that was issued in terms of certain firings that were taking place. They said, you know, in the end, you can just go and proceed normally here and perhaps get your job back. But other judges have intervened in a way to suggest that the president can't be president. You had one judge suggest that an employee, the Office of Special Counsel, that Trump fired, she ordered that he be rehired. In another judicial coup, leftist Obama judge here in D.C. essentially rehires Biden appointee fired by Trump and orders in a flagrant attack on the Constitution that Trump may not recognize the authority of any other person as special counsel. So Trump is appealing all of that. Another judge, John Bates, who's a Republican appointee from back in the day, he's been on the court a while. I think he was was he a George W. Bush appointee or a George H.W. Bush appointee? I don't recall. He ordered Trump to put up his agency over at HHS to put up web pages promoting left-wing health agenda items. As I call it, leftist healthcare agenda items. Very controversial material advocating transgender mutilation of children, essentially. So what Trump did was that he abided by the court order. The left is disappointed that Trump is following the rule of law, even though the courts aren't. But they added to the pages basically a disavowal by the Trump administration that this material is appropriate. So good for them on that. But there's this serious issue of this judicial animus, and as I call it, the judicial coup. And I went through and I highlighted some, and I was making some notes here, so bear with me. So one of the judges who initially issued one of these, in my view, improper injunctions against President Trump, this one related to birthright citizenship. Now that one, you know, there could be a case of irreparable harm, arguably. So maybe the injunction wasn't completely off in that regard, but as I even say it, I don't know if I believe it. But in issuing this ruling, he personally attacked Trump. This is the quote from Judge John Kuhnhauer. He's out, I think, in Washington State. It has become even more apparent that to our president, the rule of law is but an impediment to his policy goals. He's a Reagan appointee. The rule of law is, according to him, something to navigate around or simply ignore, whether that be for political or personal gain. Why on earth would a judge be saying something like that? That's unethical in my view, to make a political statement like that. An unneeded political statement in the context of the ruling. The debate about birthright citizenship is a debate. The fact that the president is promoting a change in the legal analysis in a way that he thinks better comports with the plain text and meaning of the Constitution, and he gets a political broadside from that, like that, from a federal judge. And I already referenced Judge Amy Berman Jackson. Here's more detail. She reinstated the head of the Office of Special Counsel after Trump fired him, an extraordinary intrusion into President Trump's core constitutional functions, the hiring and firing of employees. Now, there are areas where President Trump is telling Congress, who has tried to restrict his ability to fire agency heads and other certain employees in the federal branch and the executive branch, that they don't have the right to do that. So in some cases, he's actually violating the law in the sense that he is challenging the law by saying, I'm going to fire them anyway, and let's go to court and fight it out because I have this prerogative as president. But the idea that there's an emergency requiring that this guy be put back into office over objections of the president, and they order Trump and his team that they have to, quote, recognize his authority? Now, Judge Amy Berman Jackson is a well-known liberal jurist here in D.C., and she was criticized by Trump previously and by many others for her handling of the Roger Stone trial, Trump's friend who was a victim of lawfare. I think one of the jury members was terribly biased. It was quite obvious, and she refused to do anything about it. Another judge, Judge John J. McConnell, he was the one who issued the order ordering basically ending a temporary spending freeze by President Trump on certain grants, etc. Now, prior to him being a judge, he was a kingmaker up in Rhode Island, a Democratic kingmaker. He made a bunch of money as a plaintiff's lawyer, it looks like, major Democrat donor. If you were a Democratic politician, based on what I could find about him, you basically needed to, he was someone important to know. And so I guess in gratitude for his support politically and in recognition of his job well done, Obama and the Democrat Rhode Island senators, including Senator Whitehouse, who hates conservatives, placed him in there as a federal judge. And prior to his becoming a judge, McConnell essentially said Trump was a tyrant. Terrible evidence of bias. Would it be enough to trigger recusal? Maybe. But it shows you where he's coming from in terms of a willingness. This is why perhaps he was willing to intrude on the president's powers here. And then there's Judge Paul Engelmeyer, who prevented the Secretary of Treasury, who was confirmed by the U.S. Senate. He initially found that he can't communicate or gain access to certain Treasury payment and other financial data because he was afraid of DOJ somehow being involved. By the way, DOJ being federal employees of the President of the United States working in the White House. I mean, that order was so bad, another judge came in and kind of had to pull it back a little bit, still too restrictive of the president's prerogatives, but at least the other judge says, well, you got to let the Treasury Secretary be able to do his job. Engelmeyer, again, as I recall, another activist from Democratic Party or left-wing activists, before he was made a judge. I think he's a Biden judge. I think. Can you guys check that out in the back? And then there are like a series of judges here in D.C. who just go out of their way, in some cases, to attack President Trump. And one is a Republican appointee, Judge Reggie Walton. He's been on the bench a long time. We've appeared before him many times. He's a no-nonsense judge. You don't want to, he's a straight shooter in some respects, but he doesn't like Trump, and it's gotten the best of him, in my view. Engelmeyer is an Obama appointee. One might say that the Biden judges are Obama appointees too, but that's another debate. Walton made anti-Trump statements on CNN infamously, essentially complained also that Trump hadn't been arrested. Oh, no, that was another judge. His statement on CNN, he approved of a gag order on President Trump issued by a state court judge. I mean, federal judges shouldn't be commenting on proceedings in other courts like that. And, of course, attacking the president and complaining about the president's speech as president or as a litigant, who is before his courts and colleagues on his court. D.C. is a small court. Is inappropriate. And then, of course, there's Judge Tanya Chutkan, who presided over the Jack Smith prosecution of Trump here in Washington, D.C. Chutkan could be reliably counted on to rule against Trump on everything. I'm sure there was something that she didn't rule against him on, but you understand my point. And she was slapped back by the Supreme Court for allowing the unconstitutional prosecution of Trump over his presidential duties and responsibilities for which he has immunity. And it wasn't like it wasn't a big issue. She just gave it short shrift, and Chief Justice Roberts was furious about it. He said he didn't understand why the lower courts just pretended this wasn't an important issue. Not so much that they ruled one way or the other, in that they kind of rushed it through. He didn't say that it was obviously for politics because they wanted to get him before the election, but to me that was rather obvious. And it was Judge Chutkan who in another case had complained looks like, complained that Trump hadn't been arrested and prosecuted. It was a January 6th case. I mean, she shouldn't have been holding or presiding over Trump's trial or prosecution because of her bias. And Judge Beryl Howell, another colleague, she was chief judge here for a period of time in Washington, D.C. And the chief judge of the District of Columbia courts, I think it's true in other district courts too, they run the grand juries. They're responsible for grand jury proceedings. And she ruled against Trump on virtually everything. All sorts of civil rights issues and presidential prerogatives, executive privilege, attorney-client privilege. Trump couldn't get the time of day from Beryl Howell. And as importantly, as I mentioned with Chutkin, she allowed these violations of the Constitution in terms of the prosecution of Trump and the and kind of the rogue aspect of the prosecutors going into the president's duties and responsibilities as president and trying to prosecute him over those very actions that they had no business doing. And Judge Howell should have not let happen. She was also slapped back by the Supreme Court. So the media doesn't want to tell you about all of this, but Trump is facing a phalanx of judges who hate his guts. Judge Merchan up in New York, what did he do? I mean, you know all the rulings he made against Trump, almost on everything substantial. Literally gave money to Joe Biden's campaign in violation of ethics rules. Oh, he didn't recuse himself. Not to mention his daughter being directly involved with political enemies of Trump in the Democratic Party in terms of doing business with them. Judge after judge after judge on Trump's criminal cases, and now we're seeing on these EOs, executive orders and firings. I mean, it's not even an executive order. If being president means anything, it means the ability to hire and fire people in the executive branch, don't it? Now, as I noted, some judges are backing off on this. So he may face initial hurdles on some of this, and then more serious judges will come in and say, you can't do this. Or maybe the Supreme Court will come in and say, you can't get in the way of the president's prerogatives like this. For instance, there was a judge appointed by Joe Biden. I just saw, I think just had literally a hearing this week, or this today, where she was excoriating inspector generals who were coming in an emergency fashion to sue to get their jobs back. And she said, what are you doing here? I'll consider, we'll move this case along, but you're not getting your injunction. So it doesn't necessarily mean, to be clear, it's not the appointing authority, whether the president, that's the issue. It's the individual judges too often, because you can get judges appointed by members of either political party, presidential party, who are sensible. I mean, that you may not like their decisions in the end, but you recognize, they're serious judges. But I tell you, this anti-Trump animus is a danger to the rule of law and the judiciary. So hopefully it calms down. People just calm down. And the good news is Trump is just proceeding along, and he's not stopping. And he affirmed, because the left was all excited, oh, Trump's going to ignore the judicial rulings. And he said, I'm not going to ignore, I'm going to appeal them. He goes, I don't think these judges are right, but we're going to follow the rules. He's concerned that I'm trying to get spending curtailed and fraud stopped, and now the momentum in doing that is hampered by these biased judges, but he'll follow the rules, and the taxpayer suffers. The judge allowed, pulled back in terms of, I think it was the ruling I was talking about earlier. Now that I recall, I remember it more clearly. That the president's efforts to allow people to retire early with a severance package. You know, they get early retirements or buyouts, however you want to call it. You know, he said there's a deadline. The president said you have to decide by date X, and the judge says no, we need more time. And then just this week he said, okay, well, the president's prerogatives are correct here, and the president can set the deadline. And the deadline has since passed. So about 75,000 federal employees have taken the buyouts, so they will no longer be working after several months for the federal government. We won't be paying them. And then the president has ordered the firing of what are called probationary employees, employees recently hired. And generally, there's a period of time. I think it's a year or so that they just can be fired at will. And at least 200,000 employees in that regard are being let go. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and like our video down below.